somewhere in Soviet-controlled Poland on the morning of May 8, 1945, the day the world celebrated the end of World War II. An American soldier woke up behind barbed wire. He had survived 3 years in a German prison camp. He had survived the cold, the hunger, the uncertainty. And the night before, Soviet soldiers had come through the gate, cut the wire, and told him he was free. He was not free. He was still behind wire, different wire, same field. The flags had changed. The guards had changed. Everything else was exactly the same. He didn't know it yet, but his own government knew he was there. They had known for months. And they had decided, for reasons that made sense on paper, in Washington, very far away, that bringing him home was going to have to wait. May 8, 1945, Paris exploded. People poured into the streets, strangers kissing strangers, soldiers lifting children onto their shoulders, wine flowing from windows onto the cobblestones below. In London, a crowd of 500,000 pressed against Buckingham Palace, screaming for the king. In New York, ticker tape fell like snow on 1 million upturned faces. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The swastika was coming down from every flagpole across the continent. 6 years of slaughter, 60 million dead. And finally, it was done. That was the story the world was celebrating. Here is the story the world never heard. On that same day, the same hours, the same morning light, a group of American soldiers stood behind a fence in eastern Germany and watched the celebrations happen without them. They had survived everything. They had survived the ambush that took them prisoner. They had survived years inside German camps. The cold, the hunger, the uncertainty of whether anyone was coming. They had survived the final months of the war, when Allied bombing shook the ground and nobody knew who would be standing when the smoke cleared. And then the Soviets came. The Red Army rolled in from the east in the spring of 1945, liberating camp after camp as they pushed toward Berlin. For the Americans inside, it felt like salvation. Soviet soldiers cut the wire, handed out bread, and told them the war was over. They believed it. They were wrong. Instead of being escorted west, toward American lines, toward freedom, toward home, they were told to wait. Processing, the Soviet officer said, documentation, medical evaluation, very temporary. They marched them east, always east, away from the American sector, away from Allied territory, deeper into Soviet-controlled Poland, deeper into the unknown. And on the day the rest of the world was celebrating victory, these men arrived at a new camp, a former German facility. The swastika flags were gone, replaced with red banners, hammers and sickles stitched onto cloth. New symbols, same wire. To understand how this happened, you have to go back 3 months earlier, back to a palace on the Black Sea, where 3 men divided the world. February 1945, Yalta, Crimea. Franklin Roosevelt was dying, though few people knew how close the end was. Winston Churchill was exhausted, his empire quietly unraveling around him. And Joseph Stalin sat across from both of them with the patience of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was willing to wait for it. They were there to plan the end of the war and the world that would come after it. Among the dozens of agreements reached at Yalta was one that seemed straightforward. Article 3, Section B of the Prisoner Repatriation Protocol. All prisoners of war liberated by Allied forces shall be returned to their country of origin as rapidly as possible. Rapidly, not eventually, not when convenient. Rapidly. Roosevelt signed it. Churchill signed it. Stalin signed it. Everyone smiled for the cameras. And the moment the conference ended, Stalin had no intention of honoring it. But here is the part that almost no one talks about, the part that changes the entire story. General John R. Dean was 50 years old, a career soldier, and the head of the United States military mission in Moscow. He was America's primary military liaison to the Soviet Union, the man whose job it was to keep communication open between Washington and the Kremlin during the final phase of the war. He was also, by 1945, one of the most frustrated men in the American military. Dean had been stationed in Moscow since 1943. He had sat across the table from Soviet officials hundreds of times. He had made requests, filed paperwork, sent cables, attended meetings that lasted hours and ended with nothing. He understood, better than almost anyone in uniform, how the Soviet system worked, which is to say, how it didn't work when it didn't want to. And in the spring of 1945, before the war in Europe had even ended, Dean's mission had already begun receiving reports about American prisoners of war being held in Soviet-controlled territory. He filed a formal request with Soviet command. No response. He filed another. Silence. He sent a third request in late March. Then a fourth. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8th, General Dean's mission had contacted Soviet authorities no fewer than 9 times about the welfare and repatriation of American POWs in their custody. 9 times. 9 times they were ignored, delayed, or given answers that explained nothing. This is the first thing you need to understand. By the day the world started celebrating, Washington already knew something was wrong. Dean's cables had been going up the chain of command for weeks. The reports were sitting on desks in the War Department. Nobody told George Patton. Nobody told the American public. Patton, at 59 years old, was many things, and history has been selectively kind about which things it chooses to remember. He was, without question, one of the most gifted battlefield commanders in American history. His Third Army had advanced faster and farther than any comparable force in the history of modern warfare, from the beaches of France to the borders of Czechoslovakia in less than a year. He understood maneuver, momentum, and the psychology of the enemy in ways that few commanders of any era have matched. He was also a man with a documented history of losing control of himself at the worst possible moments. In Sicily in 1943, he walked into a field hospital and slapped a soldier suffering from combat exhaustion, calling him a coward. Eisenhower had to issue a formal reprimand. Patton's career nearly ended there. In April 1945, barely 3 weeks before the German surrender, he had made public remarks about the Soviet Union at a social function that sent Eisenhower into damage control mode again. He had been warned, clearly, directly on the record. Patton knew he was on thin ice. He knew one more major mistake would cost him everything he had built. He read the intelligence reports anyway, and then he couldn't stop thinking about them. The man who brought those reports to Patton's desk was Colonel Oscar Koch, 45 years old, quiet, precise, and methodical in a way that balanced Patton's intensity. Koch was the G2, the Chief of Intelligence for the Third Army, and he had been quietly building a picture of the prisoner situation for weeks, drawing from multiple sources: escaped soldiers who had made their way back through Allied lines, Soviet liaison officers who had let information slip, aerial reconnaissance near the Soviet occupation zone. Koch laid it out for Patton in early June. Estimated 4,000 to 6,000 American military personnel in Soviet custody, possibly more, multiple locations across Soviet-controlled Poland, Eastern Germany, and the borders of Czechoslovakia. No confirmed timeline for repatriation. No transparency from Soviet command about numbers or conditions. Patton looked at the map for a long time. Then Koch told him the part that changed everything. It wasn't just about leverage or post-war bargaining chips, though that was part of it. The deeper reason, the one that General Dean had already documented in his cables from Moscow, was something far more disturbing. In the final months of the war, as the Red Army swept westward through Germany, its soldiers had done things that no military command wanted documented. Looting on a massive scale, violence against civilian populations, German and otherwise, that went far beyond the accepted brutality of war. The systematic stripping of entire cities, factories, farms, and worse things that took years for historians to fully record. American soldiers in those liberated camps had seen it. They had watched it happen around them as they were marched east. They had talked to locals. They had seen the faces of people in Polish villages when the Red Army arrived. They were witnesses, living English-speaking witnesses who would go home and tell people exactly what they had seen. Stalin didn't want witnesses. That was the real reason. Not paperwork, not logistics, not bureaucratic confusion. He was holding American soldiers because letting them go meant letting the truth go with them. Patton stood up from his desk. He walked to the large map on the wall of his headquarters at Bad Tolz, Bavaria. Europe spread out in front of him, the thick red line dividing the American and Soviet zones, cutting through the center of Germany like a wound. East and west, free and occupied, a line that hadn't existed a year ago and now defined everything. He looked at the locations Koch had marked, the camps, the distances, how close they were to American lines, how easily, in another world, those men could simply walk home. He had made a promise, not in words, not in any ceremony, but in the way that combat commanders make promises without saying them out loud. You fight for me, I bring you home. That was the agreement. That had always been the agreement. Patton picked up a pen and wrote in his diary that night. The entry was short. He wrote about the men who should have been home by now. He wrote about the promise that combat commanders make without ceremony, without words. The entry was short. The meaning was not. He filed a formal request up the chain of command the following morning, a detailed report, names and estimated numbers, camp locations, Koch's intelligence summary, everything. It went to Schaff, to Supreme Headquarters, to Eisenhower. The Soviet response arrived 3 days later. It was brief and precise in its dishonesty. We have reviewed American claims regarding prisoners of war. We find no evidence of American military personnel in our sector. All liberated prisoners have been processed according to Yalta protocols and returned to appropriate Allied authorities. If American command believes otherwise, they are mistaken. Our records are complete and accurate. Patton read it, then read it again. He had the names, he had the testimony. He had Koch's intelligence. He had Dean's cables from Moscow, 9 formal requests, 9 non-answers, a paper trail that stretched back 3 months. And the Soviet Union was telling him these men did not exist. What happened next would not be a battle. There would be no dramatic charge, no liberating army crashing through gates. The story of what Patton did, what he tried to do, is harder and more complicated than that. It is the story of what happens when a soldier runs into the wall between military power and political reality. When the men who have the strength to act are told by the men with the authority to stop them. It is the story of 5,000 Americans who survived one war and found themselves trapped inside the beginning of another. And it starts with a general who had already been warned once, staring at a map, doing the math, and deciding that some promises are worth the consequences. June 1945, the celebrations were over, the flags had come down from the windows, the crowds had gone home. Europe was quiet now in the way that places are quiet after too much noise. A heavy, uncertain silence, full of things that hadn't been decided yet. In Moscow, General John Dean sat down for another meeting with Soviet officials. He had been doing this for months, sitting across polished tables in high-ceilinged rooms, watching men in uniform write things down in notebooks and promise to look into the matter. He had learned to read the silences between their words. He had learned what a Soviet stall looked like, the careful non-answer, the polite redirection, the reference to paperwork that never quite materialized. He had seen this before. This would not be different. The Soviet officer across the table was courteous. He expressed understanding of the American concern. He assured General Dean that all records were being reviewed, that any remaining American personnel in Soviet-controlled territory would be identified and processed according to agreed protocols. He used the word processed 4 times in 20 minutes. Dean wrote it all down. He cabled Washington that evening. The cable joined the stack of cables that had already been sent, the stack that sat on desks in the War Department while men in suits decided what to prioritize, what to risk, what to trade. In those same weeks in Bad Tolz, Bavaria, Patton was reading Koch's latest intelligence summary and trying to stay inside the limits of what he was allowed to do. It was not a comfortable place for him to be. Koch had been digging deeper. What he found was not a simple bureaucratic failure. It was not confusion born from the chaos of a continent reorganizing itself after 6 years of war. What Koch found, piece by piece, from sources inside and outside Soviet-controlled territory, was something more deliberate. The Soviets were sorting the prisoners, not processing them for return, sorting them, separating them into categories based on language, name, origin, ethnic background. They were looking for anyone who might qualify as a Soviet citizen under Stalin's expansive definition of that term, which included not just Russian nationals, but Ukrainians, Belarusians, Baltic nationals, anyone from territories the Soviet Union had absorbed before or during the war. And here was the horror buried inside that fact. Many of the men the Soviets were pulling from the population of liberated American POWs were not actually Soviet citizens by any reasonable standard. Some were Americans of Eastern European descent. Some were men born in countries that no longer existed in the form they had when those men were born. Some were simply men whose names sounded Slavic to a Soviet officer with a clipboard and the authority to make decisions. Once you were pulled from the American group, you disappeared into a different process entirely. You did not go home. This was the machinery that Dean had been trying to describe in his cables from Moscow. The machinery that ran underneath the official language of Yalta protocols and repatriation agreements. It was the early mechanism of what would later be documented as Operation Keelhaul, the forced repatriation program that Western Allied Command had quietly agreed to at Soviet insistence, under which hundreds of thousands of Soviet-claimed nationals would be returned to Stalin's authority whether they wanted to go or not. Many of them did not want to go. Some of them had fought against the Soviet Union. Some had fled it. Some were simply people who understood with the particular clarity of people who had lived under that system exactly what awaited them when they got back. Some chose to die before they would let themselves be put on those trains. American soldiers in the liberated camps had watched this happen around them. They had watched families dragged from vehicles. They had watched men fight back with their bare hands against soldiers with rifles. They had heard what happened to people at the other end of those journeys, and they were still there, still behind wire, still waiting because they had seen it. Patton took Koch's full briefing on a Tuesday morning in mid-June. He sat without moving for a long time after Koch finished. Then he said one sentence. Koch remembered it. It was Patton's assessment of the situation, and it was accurate. These men had watched everything, and now they were being kept as the price of that silence. He was 59 years old. He had been at war in one form or another for most of his adult life. He had seen men die from bullets and cold and starvation and mistakes, his mistakes sometimes, mistakes he carried. He understood that war consumed people and that no commander brought everyone home. That was the weight you learned to carry. But this was something different. This was not the cost of battle. This was the cost of politics. And Patton had very little patience for politics, even when it was practiced by people he respected. He requested a meeting with Omar Bradley. Bradley was 52 years old, and in almost every way that mattered, he was the opposite of Patton. Where Patton was combustible, Bradley was steady. Where Patton led from the front and trusted his instincts, Bradley thought in systems, logistics, supply lines, the long chain of cause and effect that determined whether a campaign succeeded or collapsed 3 weeks after it began. He had commanded more American soldiers than any general in the history of the United States Army. He had done it without flash, without the kind of theater Patton was known for, and without the string of near disasters that had followed Patton from North Africa to the German border. He liked Patton. He also worried about him constantly. when Patton laid out the situation, Koch's intelligence, Dean's cables, the Soviet sorting process, the estimated numbers, Bradley listened without interrupting. He asked precise questions. He wanted to know the sourcing on the camp locations, the confidence level on the prisoner numbers, what exactly Koch's intelligence chain looked like. Patton answered everything. Then Bradley sat back and told him something he didn't want to hear. Operation Downfall was still on the table. That was the name for the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. The operation that military planners believed would be necessary if Japan refused to surrender. The projections were devastating. Conservative estimates placed American casualties at 250,000. Other estimates, the ones that kept men in the War Department awake at night, went much higher. Soviet entry into the Pacific War was not optional. It was built into the mathematics of survival. Stalin had promised at Yalta to declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Those 3 months were running now. Every decision made in Europe in the summer of 1945 had to be weighed against what it might cost in the Pacific. If the Soviets pulled back from their Pacific commitment because an American general had moved tanks to their border over a prisoner dispute, if 5,000 men cost 50,000 or 100,000 or more, then every calculation changed. Bradley said it plainly. I understand what you want to do, George. I understand why, but I need you to understand what we might be trading for it. Patton understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. What he said next was not an argument. It was a question, and it was the kind of question that Bradley didn't have a clean answer to. If we don't hold them to Yalta now, when will we ever hold them to anything? The room was quiet for a moment. Bradley approved a limited redeployment. Elements of the 90th Infantry Division, the tough hombres, battle-tested from Normandy through Bavaria, still operational in the region, along with armored support from the 11th Armored Division, would move to forward positions near the Soviet zone. Visible, deliberate, close enough to the suspected camp locations to be impossible to ignore. They would not cross the line. They would not engage, but they would be there and they would be seen. June 22nd, 1945, American armor moved east, not in the thundering columns of the previous year, not with fighter cover and artillery preparation and the full machinery of an army going to war. Just movement, measured, intentional. Units taking up positions along the border between the American and Soviet occupation zones, at the crossing points, at the elevated ground from which Soviet observation posts would have clear sightlines. The Soviets saw it within hours. Of course they did. Their observation network along the border was thorough. Reports moved up the Soviet chain of command, American military buildup on our border. Tanks, artillery, infantry, purpose unclear. Posture, the word Soviet officers would have used in such a report, posture aggressive. The reports reached Marshal Georgy Zhukov, 48 years old, broad-shouldered, deliberate, with a face that had not softened noticeably since the worst years of the Eastern Front. Zhukov had commanded at Stalingrad. He had planned and executed Operation Bagration, the largest single military offensive in human history. He had taken Berlin. If any man in the Soviet military understood what a display of force meant and what it didn't mean, it was him. He looked at the reports from the border, and he did not order a response in kind. He picked up the telephone and called Eisenhower. That decision, to call rather than to mobilize, tells you something important about where things actually stood in the summer of 1945. Zhukov was not a man who made calls out of weakness. He made them out of calculation. And his calculation in late June of 1945 was that the political cost of a direct confrontation with American forces over the prisoner question was higher than Moscow had anticipated. The tanks on the border were not by themselves enough to change Soviet policy. But they were a signal that the Americans were willing to escalate and escalation introduced variables that nobody in Moscow wanted to manage on top of everything else that was happening. The conversation between Zhukov and Eisenhower was tense and formal, the kind of exchange between men who are communicating through the call as much as in it. Eisenhower presented the documentation, names, unit designations, dates of liberation by Soviet forces, camp locations identified through reconnaissance. He was not making accusations. He was presenting data and making clear that the data was specific enough that the standard Soviet response of general denial was no longer going to close the conversation. Zhukov said the records would be reviewed again, more carefully this time. Eisenhower said American forces would remain in their current positions until all documented personnel were accounted for. The call ended. Neither man said anything about what the tanks actually represented. They didn't need to. Both of them had spent their careers learning to read the language that armies speak when words run out. Then the waiting began. And in the waiting, Koch's intelligence teams picked up something that hadn't been in any of the original briefings. The Soviet guards at the prisoner camps were anxious, not because of the Americans on the border, or not only because of that. What Koch's sources were describing was something internal, a confusion of orders that had been building for weeks. The soldiers actually guarding the camps were low-priority assignments, tired men, poorly supplied, far from any command structure that was paying attention to them. They had received orders to hold the Americans in place, and those orders had come from high enough up that nobody at the local level was going to question them. But nobody had told them why, and nobody had told them what to do next. They were holding 5,000 American soldiers in former German camps in the middle of occupied Europe, with no clear instruction about when that would end or what purpose it was serving, while American armor sat on the horizon and the men in Moscow argued about bigger things. The machinery of Soviet bureaucracy was, in one small and critical place, running on momentum rather than intention. It was the kind of vulnerability that only existed when an order had outlived the thinking behind it. July 16, 1945. In the New Mexico desert at a location called Trinity, the United States detonated the first nuclear weapon in human history. The test was successful. The yield was larger than the scientists had predicted. The light was seen for more than 100 miles in every direction. Eisenhower was informed. A handful of senior commanders were informed. The information was guarded at the highest levels, but it moved, as information always moves, through the systems that needed to know it. Stalin had been informed through his own intelligence network that the Americans were close to a successful nuclear test. He had known this for some time. What he did not know, until the Trinity results began filtering through Soviet intelligence in the days that followed, was how close and how complete the American achievement actually was. On July 24th, at the Potsdam Conference, Harry Truman told Stalin in a brief, carefully worded exchange that the United States had a new weapon of tremendous destructive force. Stalin's face, according to every Western account of that moment, did not change. He already knew. But knowing and confirming are different things. And what Stalin confirmed at Potsdam, what every Soviet military planner had to now build into their calculations, was that the United States had crossed a threshold that changed every equation on every table in every room where decisions were being made. The prisoner transfers began in the weeks that followed. This is the part that gets lost in simpler versions of the story, the part where the tanks alone get the credit, or the diplomacy alone gets the credit, or any single factor is pulled out and made into the explanation. The truth was a convergence. Patton's armor on the border was real pressure, and it mattered. Dean's months of documentation gave Eisenhower something concrete to present to Zhukov. Bradley's willingness to approve the redeployment gave the pressure physical form. And underneath all of it, shifting the foundation of every calculation that Stalin was making, was the knowledge that the Americans had a weapon that neither conventional armies nor geographical depth could answer. The releases happened in groups, July into August. 100 men at one crossing point, 200 at another, thin, exhausted, blinking in the light of something that felt almost too late to be real. Patton was present at several of the transfer points. He stood at the border and watched them cross. He shook hands. He asked about conditions. He listened to what they had seen, and what they described was consistent with everything Koch had been reporting for months. The brutality of the Soviet occupation, the treatment of local populations. What happened to people who were pulled from the American group during the sorting process? These men were witnesses. They were going home, but not all of them. By late August, when the accounting was done and the transfers had stopped, there was a number that nobody in official Washington wanted to attach to a press release. Somewhere between 200 and 500 American military personnel remained unaccounted for. The Soviets said the record showed no additional personnel. The records were complete. The process was finished. Koch's intelligence said otherwise. Quietly, carefully, through sources that couldn't be officially acknowledged, his teams were picking up indicators that some men had been moved. Not released, moved deeper into Soviet-controlled territory, absorbed into a system so vast and so deliberately opaque that finding anyone inside it required the kind of access that no American official was going to be granted. These were not men who had been lost in the chaos of war. These were men who had been deliberately placed beyond the reach of anyone who might ask about them. Patton filed a formal protest, then another, then a third. He sent letters to Washington, to the State Department, to members of Congress he had contact with. He attached Koch's intelligence summaries. He attached Dean's original cables. He built a paper trail with the thoroughness of a man who intended for it to be read by someone, eventually, even if that someone hadn't shown up yet. Most of the letters were acknowledged and filed, not acted on. The Cold War was assembling itself from the pieces of the agreement that was falling apart. And individual soldiers, even hundreds of them, even Americans, were becoming the kind of problem that a larger problem made it easier to postpone. Patton understood what was happening. He had watched it happen in real time from the inside. He had also just made the mistake that would end his career. September 1945. Bad Tolz, Bavaria, a press conference. Patton had been managing the occupation of his sector, overseeing the denazification process, which meant deciding which Germans were allowed to hold administrative positions under the new Allied authority. His approach had been pragmatic to the point of being inflammatory. He kept German civil servants in place because they were competent, and the alternative was administrative collapse. He said at a press conference on September 22nd that the Nazi Party was comparable to the Republican or Democratic parties back home, a political organization, not a criminal enterprise, and people who had been members shouldn't be automatically excluded from contributing to Reconstruction. The quote went out on the wire services that night. Washington exploded. Eisenhower called him the following morning. The conversation did not last long. Eisenhower had warned him multiple times on the record, in writing, face to face. Patton had heard every warning and had, in some fundamental way, been incapable of treating them as binding. On October 2nd, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the army that Patton had built from the breakout at Avranches, the army that had driven further, faster than any comparable force in history, the army whose men he had buried across 2 continents and promised, in the way that commanders make promises without ceremony, to bring home. He was given command of the 15th Army instead. The 15th Army had no combat troops. Its mission was administrative, the documentation and historical analysis of the European campaign. Patton, the man who had made history, was now being asked to write it down. He understood what it meant. He was not being punished with a firing squad or a court-martial. He was being managed, moved to where he could not do any more damage to relationships that the people above him had decided were worth preserving. He accepted the assignment. He kept writing his letters. He booked a flight home for December 26th, October 1945. The Third Army no longer existed, not in any way that mattered. The men had gone home. The units had been deactivated, the equipment inventoried and shipped or scrapped, the headquarters dissolved into the bureaucracy of post-war occupation. What had been the most effective fighting force America had put into the field since Grant's army in Virginia was now a collection of files and after-action reports waiting to be archived. Patton drove to his new headquarters alone. The 15th Army occupied a requisition building in Bad Nauheim, a quiet German spa town that had spent the war largely untouched. No bomb craters, no shattered windows, no visible evidence that anything terrible had happened nearby. It felt to Patton like an insult, though he would not have used that word. He would have used a different word entirely. His staff was small. His responsibilities were narrowly defined. He was to oversee the documentation of the European campaign, the collection and organization of records, the interviewing of commanders, the construction of an official historical account of how the war in the West had been fought and won. He was 59 years old. He had commanded armies across 3 continents. He had broken the German line at Avranches, driven through France at a pace that left his supply lines perpetually behind him, crossed the Rhine, reached the Czech border. Now he was writing it down. He sat at his desk in Bad Nauheim and he wrote, not the official history that came later, assembled by other hands. He wrote letters. He wrote in his diary. He wrote the way a man writes when he has run out of people willing to listen to him in person, with the particular intensity of someone who believes the record matters even when no one is paying attention to it yet. He wrote about the prisoners. He wrote about the men who had not come home, the 200 or 300 or 500. The number changed depending on which intelligence summary you were reading, and none of them were official, and none of them were going to become official anytime soon. He wrote about what the returning soldiers had told him at the transfer points, what they had seen in the camps, what they had seen in the villages around the camps, what the Red Army had done in the territories it controlled to the people who lived there, and the deliberate and systematic nature of it. He wrote about Operation Keelhaul, though he did not yet have that name for it. He described what it was, the forced return of hundreds of thousands of people to a government that would punish them for having survived in the wrong place. He described what he had witnessed and what his intelligence officers had documented. He addressed the letters to Washington, to the State Department, to members of Congress, to old colleagues who had influence and access. He was not naive. He knew what happened to letters that arrived without political backing. He knew the difference between filing a complaint and changing a policy, but he also knew that he was going home in December. And he believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had not yet learned to stop believing in things, that if he could stand in front of the American people and say what he had seen, it would matter. That the truth, delivered plainly to people who had sons and brothers and fathers who had worn the uniform, would be impossible to simply file away. He had something to say. He booked his flight for December 26th, December 9th, 1945. It was a Sunday morning, cold and gray, the kind of German winter day that arrives without drama and stays without mercy. Patton was not working. He was going pheasant hunting with General Hobart Gay, Hap Gay, his chief of staff, 50 years old, the man who had been at his side through the entire campaign, who had unrolled the maps on the desk at Bad Tolz, who had carried out every order without requiring an explanation of the thinking behind it. Gay had arranged it as a deliberate thing, a morning away from the desk, away from the letters and the files and the official record of a war that was over. They drove out in a Cadillac Model 75 staff car a large and well-built vehicle, the kind that conveyed authority even in peacetime. 2 other vehicles accompanied them. The roads were clear. On the outskirts of Mannheim, crossing a set of railway tracks on the Kaffertal-Seckenheim road, an army truck made a left turn directly in front of Patton's car. The collision was low speed, the kind of accident that happens 100 times a day on roads where military vehicles and civilian traffic share space without adequate signage or coordination. The truck was barely damaged. Gay was shaken but unhurt. The driver was unhurt. Everyone in the accompanying vehicles was unhurt. Patton was thrown forward against the partition between the front and rear compartments. He did not lose consciousness immediately. He looked at Gay and said, and Gay recorded these words because he understood immediately that they mattered, "My neck hurts. I think I'm paralyzed." He was right. The fracture was at the 3rd cervical vertebra. The spinal cord was not severed, but the damage was severe enough that Patton had no function below the neck from the moment of impact. He was conscious. He could speak. He could think with complete clarity. He could not move anything below his shoulders. He was taken to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. The Army's best available neurosurgeons were flown in. X-rays confirmed the fracture. The prognosis was not given to Patton directly, not at first, but the men who reviewed his films understood what they were looking at. He had turned 60 the month before. He had a complete cervical fracture with spinal cord involvement. He was 12 days away from flying home. He spent the next 12 days in that hospital bed, and in those 12 days he received visitors, dictated letters, and talked to the people who came to see him with the same directness he had always used, the directness that had made him difficult and effective and frequently infuriating in equal measure. Beatrice came. His wife of 35 years flew across the Atlantic the moment she received the cable. She had survived the entirety of the war on the other side of an ocean, raising their children and running their household and waiting for word that never came about whether her husband was alive or dead on any given day. She arrived in Heidelberg and sat beside his bed and held the one hand that could still register that she was holding it. He told her he intended to recover. He told her they were going home together. He told her he had things to say and people to say them to, and that a broken neck was not going to stop him from saying them. She believed him because she had always believed him, and because 35 years of marriage to George Patton had given her a detailed understanding of the distance between what he intended and what the universe was willing to allow. He received other visitors too, officers who had served with him, correspondents who had covered the Third Army, men who understood that they might be saying goodbye without being able to say that out loud. He was alert through all of it. He asked questions. He gave opinions. He did not perform the role of a dying man because he did not believe he was dying. December 21st, 1945. 12 days after the accident, Patton developed a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that moved into his lungs. In 1945, there was no treatment that could reliably address it. The medical staff did what they could. At 5:50 in the afternoon, George Smith Patton Jr. died. He was 60 years old. He had been in the Army for 36 years. He had commanded forces in Morocco, Sicily, France, Luxembourg, Germany, and Czechoslovakia. He had never been seriously wounded in combat, not once, in 2 world wars. He died in a hospital bed in Heidelberg 12 days after a low-speed traffic accident, 17 days before he was scheduled to fly home. He was buried at his own request with his men, not in Arlington, not in the ceremonial ground reserved for generals and statesmen. He was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army in the country where they had fought together in the winter of 1944. Among the graves of men he had commanded and mourned and promised to remember. The promise he kept was the one nobody saw. The letters he had written from Bad Nauheim were received, acknowledged, and filed. The prisoners he had documented, the 200 or 300 or 500 who had not come home, remained undocumented in any official sense. The Soviet Union maintained that all American personnel had been accounted for. The United States government, navigating the first years of a Cold War that was assembling itself with alarming speed, did not press the matter in any forum where pressing it would require a public answer. The men existed in the gap between what had happened and what anyone was prepared to say had happened. That gap would remain open for decades. In 1947, General John Dean published his memoir. He called it The Strange Alliance. It was a careful, precise, and deeply frustrated account of 2 years spent trying to work with the Soviet military bureaucracy, months of formal requests about American prisoners, meetings that went nowhere, cables that produced nothing. He described the system clearly and without exaggeration. The book was reviewed politely and largely forgotten. In the 1970s, researchers began piecing together the full scope of Operation Keelhaul. What had been a classified program, the forced repatriation of Soviet-claimed nationals to Stalin's authority, was gradually exposed through declassified documents on both sides of the Atlantic. The numbers that emerged were staggering. Estimates ranged from 1 million to more than 2 million people forcibly returned to the Soviet Union between 1944 and 1947. Many had begged not to go. Some had fought. Some had died rather than go. The Western Allied governments had agreed to this, quietly, in documents that took 30 years to surface. In 1991, the United States Senate established the Senate Select Committee on PW and MIA affairs. Among the questions it investigated was whether American prisoners of war had been held in the Soviet Gulag system, not just from World War II, but from Korea and Vietnam as well. The committee reviewed documents that had become available after the Soviet collapse. What it found was not a clean answer. It found indicators, records, testimonies, fragments, suggesting that some American military personnel had entered the Soviet detention system and had not come out through any channel that anyone had recorded. The full picture could not be reconstructed. The records that would have completed it either did not survive or were not made available. The committee's final report used careful language. It could not confirm, it could not rule out. The gap remained. Here is what the historical record does confirm. Yalta was signed in February 1945. The repatriation clause was clear. Stalin had no intention of honoring it on the terms that Roosevelt and Churchill understood. General Dean filed 9 formal requests before the war ended. 9. He documented the Soviet obstruction in real time, in cables and letters that survived, in a memoir that was published while the events were still recent. Patton received Koch's intelligence in early June 1945 and responded by doing the only things available to him: formal protests through official channels, followed by limited military pressure that Bradley approved and Eisenhower ultimately allowed to stand. The prisoner releases happened in the summer of 1945, concurrent with the Potsdam Conference and the revelation of the American nuclear test at Trinity. The convergence of those factors, military pressure, sustained documentation, and the fundamental shift in strategic balance introduced by nuclear capability created the conditions in which Stalin found it more useful to release most of the prisoners than to continue holding them. Most, not all. Patton was relieved of command in October 1945 for statements that were factually defensible and politically catastrophic. He spent his final weeks writing letters that went unanswered, documenting things he had seen that he intended to say publicly, and counting the days until he could board a plane and say them. He never boarded the plane. He died in December in a hospital in Heidelberg, having never returned to the country he had spent his life serving. What neither of them could solve, what no general and no diplomat and no amount of pressure ultimately resolved, was the question of the men who didn't come home. The men who didn't come home had names. They had families who waited for them, mothers who kept writing letters to addresses that no longer existed, wives who eventually stopped waiting without ever quite stopping hoping, children who grew up knowing their father's name from a photograph and a telegram and the particular silence that fills the space where someone should have been. They had survived the German camps. They had survived the war. They had watched liberation arrive and believed in the way that men believe things when they have waited long enough for them that the worst was over. They were wrong about that. They disappeared into a system that was designed in part to make people disappear. And the governments that might have gone after them decided one by one and year by year that the cost of asking the question loudly enough to get a real answer was higher than they were willing to pay. That decision was made by people with titles and authority and genuine responsibilities. It was not made carelessly. The men who made it understood what they were trading away. They made it anyway. That is the part of this story that has no resolution. That is the part that stays open. Patton understood it too, toward the end. In one of the last letters, he wrote from Bad Nauheim, a letter addressed to an old colleague in Washington, a letter that was received and filed and not acted on. He wrote what anyone who had stood at those transfer points and counted the men coming through already understood. The men who were left behind were not a diplomatic problem, they were a debt. And debts of that kind did not expire. He was right about that. He was buried in Luxembourg in December 1945 among the men he had commanded and promised to remember 17 days before he was supposed to go home. The debt he described is still outstanding. That is where the story ends, not with a victory, not with a clean resolution, not with justice delivered and accounts settled and the record put right. It ends with a number that nobody made official and names that nobody put on a list that anyone in authority was willing to stand behind, and a general buried in foreign soil who spent his last weeks writing letters that nobody answered. It ends the way the hardest parts of history always end, with something left unfinished, with something still owed,